Out of the street corners they scream. You knew it was coming. You've been waiting for this for months. Rumour hardened into fear and now they scream at you. The sirens, their hysterical wail tearing through the white noise of the city. And you run. You run to pick up those things that can never be replaced. A picture of them in the days when they still loved you. Your mother's wedding ring. And then you turn to your shelf of games. You only have room for 5. 5 games for Doomsday. 5 Games for Doomsday is a show in which board game personalities are thrust into a cabin in the woods to outrun an oncoming disaster, but can only take 5 of their games with them. But which will they choose? This week's guest is a wearer of many hats. He's the designer of Wordsy, Battle Merchants, and the wildly successful The Networks, which he published himself through his imprint Formal Ferret Games. He heads up the Breaking Into Board Games podcast, and is the current incumbent of the second chair of the premier board game design podcast Ludology. He is, if you haven't already guessed, Gil Hova. Gil, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
So, you're the first guest on this inaugural new project that I'm starting. How difficult was it to choose the 5 games?
It was pretty challenging because I found myself, like, the games that really said more about me as a person turned out to not be board games, so I wound up giving you 2 lists. I gave you a list of 5 board games, which were tricky to pick, and then I gave you another list of, like, 8 games that most of which were not board games, and a few of which were board games that I don't really play anymore, but they say a lot more about my journey as a game designer.
Yeah, so basically, you said to me that you were choosing games that talked about you more as a designer than as a gamer.
Yeah.
Are they mutually exclusive things, or do they often meld? And does your predilections as a gamer affect your predilections as a designer?
There's a little overlap. And so if I were just taking it from a game point of view, I think the list would be similar. I think this comes back to how I was, like, I remember when I first started doing game design, I spent, like, a long time trying to make the perfect bluffing game, you know? And then I played Werewolf, and I realized I hated bluffing games. And I hated negotiation games, and I hated games where you had to try to read the other person's mind. And I think that's important for both game designers and gamers, but especially game designers, because you really want to be working on games that you love. And in order to figure out what games you love, you have to play a lot of games. And eventually you realize that there's different aesthetics. When I first started with this hobby, when I realized that there was this new breed of games, I said, I'm going to play everything. It's not like I'm going to like everything, but I wanted to try to be an omni-gamer, to not be limited by genre and to say, well, my taste cuts across everything, I won't care if a game is one or the other. Well, that didn't work. I enjoy economic Euro games. I enjoy party games. Outside board games, I enjoy storytelling games. I enjoy interactive fiction. But, I'm not a huge Ameritrash fan. I don't think there's any fault with the genre. It's just not to my taste. As I mentioned before, social deduction really just doesn't float my boat. I really enjoy Spyfall, which is interesting. That's the only social deduction game I've really enjoyed so far. But Werewolf, The Resistance, they just don't do anything for me. And so I think that was really important as a designer to learn my tastes so that I'm not trying to make a social deduction game.
But do you think so you own your own publishing house, which to some degree dictates that you can pretty much design what you choose to design and put it out, and, hopefully the market will bear that. But do you think there are other types of designers who are designers for hire, who will design anything as long as there's a paycheck at the end, and their preferences don't really figure much into the design work they do?
I don't think so. I don't see that yet, simply because there just isn't enough money in the hobby yet. Like, it's not like, what are you designing for? Are you designing for the money? Well, guess what? There's no money, so you'd better be designing for the love of it. I mean, I could see maybe someone wanting to design for, like, the quote-unquote glory or the cool points, but I don't think I've seen anybody I think the only exception, maybe every once in a while you get someone new to the hobby and they say, I'm going to make a game. You see them enter the hobby just as they're making these games, and they realize that their tastes in games don't always align with the hobby. So I think I see that a little more often, but I don't really see guns for hire at this point. Maybe someday we will, but right now I don't see it.
So if we go back, so you're from New Jersey, and you sent me a bio, and it said that you played a lot of sort of Steve Jackson games and those sorts of things when you were younger, but you played them on your own because as you said in the text, that you were not a well-adjusted kid.
I wasn't.
What does that mean?
Well, first off, just to quickly correct you, I grew up in New York, on Long Island. A lot of people are kind of sensitive. New Jersey is not the most glamorous of places. So this is where geography and political lines kind of fail. Anyway, all this to say, identify a little more New Yorker, even though I'm technically in New Jersey, blah, blah, blah. I'm a pretentious whatever you want to call me. Yes, so,
I mean, were you setting fire to buildings and
no,
bleaching roadkill and things like that?
No. The way I'm talking right now, that's pretty much how I talked when I was 10 years old, which is not like a boast. I'm not saying, oh, I was such a smart kid. No, I was a pretty, I just didn't know how to talk to people. So I talked the way I read in books. I talked the way I saw on TV and heard on movies. And, it's just not a natural way of talking. And I had weird interests and I didn't know how to act and I didn't know how to behave. And I was just sort of out of sync and out of step, So it was kind of lonely, I guess. I don't say this as a pity party kind of thing, but I think it's relevant because it informed my journey as a game designer, because here I am playing Car Wars by myself in my room, like I'm 12 or 13, and I'm getting a sense of games as a collection of rules and learning how rules reflect theme and looking at things from a mechanical point of view. And when I started getting some friends and we started diving into role-playing games, I remember raving about the system of this role-playing game I was reading about. And my friend said, yeah, Gil only really cares about the systems, It's just something that always kind of struck me, that these games had systems that were built and constructed. Whereas, when I was younger growing up, games were just sort of this thing. Like Monopoly is just this cultural artifact that at a certain point in your life has always been there, and you don't think of someone having crafted it or even the rules being sort of tweaked from generation to generation the way a game like, say, chess has.
I think Monopoly is very similar to old standard card games in many ways. I don't remember ever, and I played Monopoly many times through my childhood, anyone ever looking at the rule book in all the times that I ever played Monopoly, And of course, the rules that we played had really very little relevance to the rules as written, but it's become folkloric now, right?
Absolutely, and it was that way even way back then, from when it was the Landlord's Game, designed by Elizabeth Maggie. So she designed it, and she put it out in the world, not as a manufactured thing, but just as this sort of protest against capitalism and saying, well, if you open up the capitalism, this is how it's going to be. You're going to have the rich fleecing the poor. But then as people encountered it, they would make their own boards. They would hear about it. They would play by their slightly different rules. And Charles Darrow's rules eventually became the rules that were printed in the box. And I would say the rules that we've all become familiar with, but no, we're not familiar with those rules because, as you say, we all play with our own rules. Absolutely. It was even folkloric back then, in that there were so many versions of the Landlord's Game. It's really, really fascinating.
You leave school, you go to college. In college, you've referred to it, you play role-playing games, and then you leave college, and in your 20s, you get introduced to the first game on your list.
So I learned Magic in college. It must have been 1994, 93 or 94. And there was this dude with long blonde hair, wore Doctor Who t-shirts. He was really into writing, really into fantasy, and really into games. And I wasn't that into games. I was into music in college. I wasn't that into games. But I met up with him at a game store at one point, and he taught me this new game called Magic. He kicked my butt, and I realized that, actually, I don't think he taught me. I think I'd already learned the rules, but that game with him, I realized this guy, he's got all the cards and he's just going to beat me every time. So I think that's when I stopped playing Magic, is when I played him. That guy went on to join this small publishing company called Paizo, and he's one of the bigwigs in Paizo now. So I met up with him at Gen Con like 2 years ago, like, holy crap! I can't believe that, we wound up in the same industry. Of course, he's at a company that's a huge mega company, like he's really up there. So I was really, really pleased to see his success. So that's my little college gaming story. Okay, so let's go to the first game on my list. So here I am. I'm real into video games. Like I said, I wasn't into gaming. That's a bit of a lie. I was very into video games. I loved X-Wing. I loved Grim Fandango, Doom, Quake. You get the idea that there's all these video games. I really enjoyed playing these video games on my computer. And so I thought, wouldn't it be great to be a video game designer? I mean, even as a kid with an Atari 2600, I was like, oh, what must it be like to make these games? At the time, companies like Electronic Arts were putting the designers' names on the packaging, so I knew that these games were made by someone. Oh, what must it be like to make a game? And then growing up, Steve Jackson, when they released Car Wars, they had this periodical that you could write in with like suggested rules and add-ons to Car Wars and fiction about Car Wars, and that all sort of added to the corpus. And I realized, oh, what must it be like to change the rules and tweak things and put your own thing? So I thought, okay, I'd love to be a video game designer. So I realized getting out of college, I'm in my mid-20s, I'm like, okay, I want to be a video game designer. I should start with board games, though, because at least I'll get a peer review. Okay, so what's Steve Jackson up to? They got this little game called Munchkin. I read a little more about this game called Settlers of Catan, which is supposedly this new style of game called Euros. So I go to a convention. I drive to a convention, my first ever game convention, and I play Munchkin, and, I don't want to say it was underwhelming because I didn't have anything to compare it to. I'm like, yeah, okay, this is pretty much a game. You screw people over, you mess with people. That's what a game is. Like, okay, I prefer my video games, but sure. Then I played Settlers, and I thought it was pretty good. Then some guy comes up to me I'm in between games, and he's like, hey, you free? Do you want to play a game? I'm like, sure, what's it called? He's like, it's a new game. It's called Puerto Rico. You're going to love it. And I sit down to play Puerto Rico, and this was the first time I've ever played a game that you don't have to directly mess with people. And it's not about negotiation. It's not about taking people's stuff. I mean, there's a little bit of interaction, but it's mostly you and the game system. And, I've always been into game systems, even as a kid. So suddenly this game that's about game systems, I'm hooked. Like, I'm totally hooked. There's all this crunch that I expect from a video game, and it's here in cardboard, and I'm sitting with other players, and I'm interacting with humans, which I've historically been terrible at, but now I've got this thing that will let me talk to humans and let me figure out, like, how to work with them and how to talk to them. And so, Puerto Rico really pulled me into games. Like, a lot of people say you have to introduce people with a simple game, and for me, it wasn't a simple game that pulled me in. It was, it was a fairly up there game. I wouldn't say really complex, because obviously there's a lot of games way more complex than Puerto Rico, but, for a beginner, Puerto Rico is pretty much up there, and yet that was the game that pulled me in.
So what is it about Puerto Rico? It's still considered with incredible high regard for a game that is 15 years old now. What is it about Puerto Rico, and why does it still continue to bewitch gamers? So
Jeff Engelstein and I did an episode recently where Jeff came across a theory that in game design we've been moving more and more towards small but effective single actions in a game that propel people towards their goals. And Puerto Rico really, really has that. If you look at a game released right around the time Puerto Rico came out, a game like Tikal, but Tikal is also a game where you have a zillion things you can do in your turn, and you're going to spend some time, even if you're not an AP prone player, you have to spend some time parsing and doing the mental jigsaw and figuring out what fits where. Whereas Puerto Rico, you pretty much got one choice out of, like, up to maybe 7, depending on how many people are playing. Like, which of these choices are you going to make? And then once you do that, how are you going to manipulate that? But ultimately, it's which choice you're going to make out of this relatively small list of choices. So even though the game space, the number of choices isn't that big, the game space is much larger. And being able to get that efficiency, that sort of economy of choice, that I'm not going to give you a lot of choices, but those choices are going to be incredibly meaningful. That's one of the hallmarks of really great game design. A lot of new designers will show a game and there's a zillion things you can do on your turn and none of them are interesting, So a good game is not necessarily a game that gives you a ton of choice. A good game is a game that gives you choices that are meaningful. Even if the choice is binary, A or B, if that's a very meaningful decision, then that will most likely lead to a good and engaging game. There's a whole bunch of other things that make up a good and interesting game, but that's certainly one of the things that I think appeals to people, and I think that's one of the reasons behind Puerto Rico's success.
Okay, so Puerto Rico has come under fire recently in the last few years because people have said that it's thematically problematic. Do you think that's the case, and has that affected your opinion of the game?
It absolutely is thematically problematic. 100%. I mean, it's, so like, I'm white, I'm from New York City. The idea that it misrepresents Puerto Rico's history does not really represent a burden to me, and I have the privilege of enjoying and playing the game. But that's not going to be the case for everybody. There's going to be some people who play it and they'll be like, okay, I'm taking these brown colonists and putting them in a plantation. That's weird, My rationalization was always that it's a much better game than a document of history, but putting the name Puerto Rico on it is very problematic. Now, I don't think the solution here is to cleanse it with fire. I don't think the solution is just to chuck it in the bin. I think the solution is, as long as you're comfortable playing it, continue to play it, but don't let it off the hook. Talk about it and say, all right, well, let's talk about these little brown figures. They're a little weird, right? And then for the next generation of gaming, try to do a little better. I mean, it's like that with other forms of media, even going back, like if you look at someone like H.P. Lovecraft, modern horror does not necessarily need to be racist like H.P. Lovecraft was, and H.P. Lovecraft had incredible influence on his genre, even though he had political views that were pretty poisonous. So I think that you can survive it, but you still have to talk about it, and you still have to frame it and say, okay, well, this did still have problems, and we should talk about what has issues as well as what's good. I mean, this is just how you have to deal with history, going back all the way, if you want to look at American history and looking at founding fathers who owned slaves, this is how you have to take what we perceive as good as well as the really nasty stuff. And one doesn't forgive the other and one doesn't destroy the other, but I think we have to be capable of holding both in our heads.
So, moving on then, you started to design games. When you first became a designer, were they terrible, or were you some sort of game design savant who came sort of fully formed into the world as a game designer and you just untapped some subconscious ability?
Well, clearly it was number 2, right? No, it was number 1. I was terrible. My games were just, they started out just freaking unplayable. They were absolutely horrible.
So how do you carry on then? If they're terrible, where does the spark of stamina come from to carry on and get better?
I think in retrospect, I had a little bit of Dunning-Kruger syndrome. I didn't realize just how bad I was. Dunning-Kruger syndrome, right?
So for the people who don't know, Dunning-Kruger says that people who are bad at something have a very poor perception of how bad they are, and they might tend to think that they're better. It's in the same way that 80% of people say they're above average at driving, right?
Yeah, I thought I was a lot better at game design than I really was. And I think, in retrospect, that's what kept me going. It was sort of this Inspector Clouseau kind of confidence that I just bumbled my way from like one poor design to another. And I think a lot of it was I was inexperienced with games. I didn't have a good understanding of my own tastes. And I started playing my own games. And as I found regular gaming groups, and especially once I found a regular playtest group, things started to get better and better and better as I started to incorporate game design lessons. I think a great teacher like if you really want to learn good game design, you play test other people's games and you really get a sense of this person is having a real problem with their game. How do we fix it? And you get a real sense of the best way to address shortcomings in prototypes. Because also, I think if you really love a form, if you really love a genre, you're an actor, Ben. Maybe you can back me up on this. As an actor, I'd imagine you have to see and participate in a lot of really bad or mediocre plays. Is that correct?
I mean, it's about learning what, this sounds really facile now, but it's about learning what is good and how to react and how to listen. And the simple, I compare it very much to playing sport. As long as you can find a spark in it that's enjoyable, it doesn't mean you're bad, but you will improve the more you do it, right?
Yeah. And I think another part, I want to, I use the word bad game, and that's not really a great term when you're talking about a prototype, because when you're talking about a prototype, I don't think this is going to sound very like kindergarten-y. I don't think there are bad prototypes. I think there's just prototypes that need work. Obviously, once the prototype gets released and it becomes a game, I think you can make an argument that this is a bad game because X, Y, and Z. I mean, that's a separate discussion. But I think that's a lot more defensible. But with a prototype, to just write off a prototype, like I had somebody play one of my prototypes and then they went and they rated it a 6 on Board Game Geek, and that felt kind of weird. It also taught me to not put an entry for Board Game Geek for my game until I'm comfortable with someone rating it a 6. If I feel like it's going to change,
it's like someone watching a rough cut of a movie and then writing a New York Times review.
Exactly. Like if there's still some malleability to it, I mean, I don't think passing a harsh final judgment is in order. You know, if it's in its final form, absolutely sharpen those knives. But if there's things that can change, I would avoid the word bad. Anyway, so yes, I think my point being, if you are in a form, you really love the form, you have to sit through a lot of manifestations of that form that are just not very good, or that need a lot of work. And you have to be used to that. And I think there's a certain point where if you love that form enough, you like the whole puzzle of, well, how do I get better? How do I make this better? How do I improve this? You know, if I'm at a play and if I'm even part of a play, if I'm part of a reading for a play, and I know the playwright's working on this, like, what can I do to this character to make it more believable, even though the lines don't really seem like language that somebody would be speaking? That sort of thing, you know? So the same thing with a board game, you know, when you play a prototype, you start learning, oh wow, well, if you just tweak this, if you remove, and sometimes you get into this whole, oh wow, if you remove this whole system, like this part of the game, that's a really cool part of the game, but you remove this cool part of the game and the game gets better.
Yeah, I write fiction, and I think it's very akin to writing fiction in that it's that Samuel Johnson thing where he said, if you write a beautiful line, strike it out. And I think what he was trying to say is, don't fall in love with every aspect of your creation, because it is trite, but killing your darlings is the best way to make your art work.
There's another line from screenwriting, which is, no line is worth a scene, no scene is worth a script. And it's the same thing. You know, even if that line is the best line in your movie, it's not about the line on its own merits, it's how it fits into the whole work. Same thing with the game. You know, if this part of the game is not fitting in, it doesn't matter if that part of the game is awesome and amazing. If it's jarring, it's jarring. It may have to get cut out. So yes, killing your darlings is a real important thing of being part of that.
Coming on to your next game is, you've chosen a game by a designer who seems to be the epitome of someone who's able to design and is able just to knock out games in various genres and do them to a consistently high level. And you've chosen Lost Cities by Knizia. What is it about him?
So the thing about Lost Cities in particular, especially at the time when I played it, I think I learned it probably around 2005, I think is when I played it. Around that time. I could be off by a few years. But somebody taught it to me, and my reaction was, that's it? That's the whole game? Is there a card that lets you, like, attack the other player? Is there a card that lets me modify numbers? Don't I get any powers? And no, it's just all about these numbers and placing cards in sequence. And yet, it was perfect. It was just what the game needed. It was minimal. It was very minimalist. It had exactly what it needed and nothing more. And I could just imagine like a playtester, telling her, Knizia, no, you have to add this, it's not enough. And Knizia saying, no, I think it's good. I that really struck me and hit me in this idea of, you don't need, game design isn't about putting everything in, sometimes it's just about putting just the right things in. And Lost Cities is just a great example of just enough.
I got into the hobby after Knizia's great games like Through the Desert and Tigris and Euphrates. And quite honestly, when I got into the hobby, I never quite understood people talking about him in such reverent tones. And if I'm honest, I still kind of don't. What has he given to the hobby, Knizia?
You know what this is like? This is like when I got into music, I was into heavy metal, I was into Metallica, I was into Anthrax, groups like that. Led Zeppelin did nothing for me. Absolutely nothing. And in retrospect, I think it was a similar thing. So much of the music I listened to was built on Led Zeppelin that Led Zeppelin almost became a priori, It almost became this just assumed thing. And listening to it, it was just kind of self-evident. But I'm sure if I was there in like 1971 listening to Led Zeppelin for the first time, it would just be mind-blowing, Like, wow, these guys rock! This drummer, I've never heard anything like this drummer. So I think it was the same thing with Knizia, because when Knizia came out with his games and they were just so mathematically perfect, I think that's really what resonated with a lot of people. It's just this feel of this precision from his games, and he's got just what the game needs. And if anything, I know that eventually, like, he started feeling a little samey as people started to want a little more from their games and the market started shifting a little. He wasn't quite able to keep up. I mean, he's still busy, still making games. I mean, he had a Spiel des Jahres nomination, so he's doing just fine. But he's, in his heyday, yeah, he had this real feel of perfection about it. You know what it was like? You were around, Ben, for the whole microgame movement. I think a lot of the people who played microgames, what they got out of microgames was what I got out of Lost Cities. This idea of this perfect elegance that, like, it's just exactly what the game needs and no more, It's almost like the board game equivalent of a tiny house, This idea of this just simple, perfect minimalist living,
I mean, I was really surprised at Essen when I was walking around one of the halls and I saw Knizia coming out of a pitch meeting that he'd had with one of the publishers. And Knizia's this legendary figure and he's very recognizable and everyone in the hobby knows who it is. And I was genuinely surprised that, wow, Knizia has to pitch his games to people like everyone else.
Oh, absolutely. Having a name like Knizia gets you in the door and gets you meetings, but it doesn't necessarily get your games picked up. Now, he's going to have like 4 or 5 designs to pitch to them and to be like, okay, what about this? What about this? What about this? But yeah, he still has to do the work, I still think the world of him. I think the guy is a phenomenal designer. I think he's very smart, and the interviews that I've read with him, he's given outstanding game design advice. This guy knows what he's doing. He really, I mean, I know that's the understatement of the decade, but he was an outstanding teacher, just in terms of the interviews that I read of him and the games I've played from him. I mean, Ra is still one of my favorite auction games, just because it goes down to this like binary choice again, or not binary, but just the small number of decisions, but the decisions feel so meaningful and so impactful, and they're not obvious, and that takes real skill and practice to hone. So yeah, I really respect him.
So you go through your first forays into game design, you design these Franken games that are absolutely terrible, but eventually you get signed and you get published. What is it like to hold that first published game in your hand when it's been produced and your name is on the box and the title of the game is emblazoned and there's art and suddenly you have an artifact that you've created?
Well, it was very different between my first game and my second game. My first game was Prolix, and my reaction was, oh no, because I had been under the impression that it would come in a box about the size of Pandemic, and Prolix is about half the size. So right away I was like, uh-oh. And I opened it up. The tiles were about the size I expected them, but the bag was tiny, and I said, oh no, this bag is too small. And sure enough, people online were like, this bag's too small, because it's got a bunch of letters that are these chipboard tiles, and you put them in a bag, and you draw them out of the bag. And the bag was just big enough to fit the tiles, which you don't want. You want to be able to stick your hand in and shuffle the tiles around and pick one. You don't want to, like, stick your hand in, like, feel pain because you're, like, punching this wall of tile. And that's what happened with Prolix. So, it was honestly a little bit of disappointment with Prolix. And, but with my second game, Battle Merchants, it was much better. Minion did a beautiful job with it, and the game looked absolutely gorgeous. And it was really, I don't want to use the word surreal because that word's overused. It just felt like a kind of like an out-of-body experience, like, this is my life now, you know? My name on boxes, just like Reiner Knizia, you know? It's incredible. Yeah, that's a pretty amazing feeling when you're holding this thing that you worked on and you've got the final version in your hands. It's like, okay, so I guess this is it now. It's pretty amazing. Nowadays, as a publisher, I get that a little earlier when the art starts coming in. That's an amazing feeling, like, okay, this is what the game's going to look like.
And do you still have that feeling? Now you have such a hands-on approach to every aspect of the game, being the publisher. When you get that final box in your hand, is there still that frisson? Or by that point, are you completely familiar with what the game is and how it should look?
Oh, it never goes away. It doesn't go away. It always feels amazing. I mean, there is also a mix of terror in it, because a lot of times when I'm getting it, I'm getting the proof copy, and I'm terrified of missing something. I'm terrified of getting something wrong and missing a misprint, or realizing that there's a card that's supposed to be there that's not there, missing that something's not cut properly. It's a mix of joy and terror, I guess is what it is. There's got to be a German word for that.
So moving on from one designer publisher to another, my segues are astonishing. Your next game is an absolute titan of the hobby. It is one that I made sure to play when I started gaming because people said, this is one of the games. And as this show goes on, I think many people will choose your first game and many people will choose this one too. And this is Power Grid. Why Power Grid? You wrote in your description that it breaks the rules.
Yeah.
How does it do that?
Yes. The auction is so fiddly. I mean, after each auction, you take the lowest card and put it on the bottom of the deck. And then you have to remember certain other times of the game where you have to remove cards from the auction and take them out of the game. Like every time you have more cities in play than the lowest number card, you have to remove that. And there's just so much to remember. It's so much of a cognitive load. And if I was with playtesters, they'd be like, oh, Gil, this game's so fiddly. It's so weird. And it works. It works great. It's amazing because it turns out those rules all have extremely specific purposes and they all serve the game. And because the game is an economic game and because it's about powering cities, people are expecting a certain amount of cognitive overhead. You do a ton of math in the game. You have to add, say, 38 and 45, which a lot of people aren't really comfortable just doing in their heads. That's one of the games that you start seeing calculators coming out and people typing in calculators. This is a game about running power companies, and you kind of expect that kind of math. So the theme sort of offers this bit of forgiveness for it, whereas in other games, like if this were a game about slaying dragons, you would not want to add 38 and 45 together, You'd want some immediacy. You'd want visceralness to this game. And since Power Grid is not about visceralness, it can break that rule. And that was a really interesting thing to see, just seeing how many rules could be broken in a game like Power Grid. In the end, the game actually is quite elegant in its own way. It doesn't have a ton of rules. It just has a few fiddly rules that you have to keep in mind. But other than those things that seem like that they're band-aids, but they're actually struts, like real load-bearing support struts. Man, from band-aids to support struts, that's a mixed metaphor. So it turns out that, that these things aren't just this thing that the designer tossed in, but they're real load-bearing columns that bear a lot of the game's weight. I learned how you could sort of break these rules. Like Power Grid does not feel like a Knizia game because in so many ways it feels inelegant and almost, I want to use the word sloppy, even though it's not a sloppy game. But at first, like from a Kinesia point of view, if you're going from like Tigris and Euphrates to Power Grid's going to feel a little sloppier, and yet Power Grid has just this great flow to it. You're excited about your next turn, and it nails so much really well. And it let Friedman like do so many other games. So it's a phenomenal game, and absolutely was a huge influence on me.
I mean, I'm very happy that I tried it early on in my game career before I had a conception about what elegant was and sloppy was, so I could allow the game just to stand on its own, because the longer you play games, the more you assume you know, and you can let your preconceptions get in the way of enjoying something that's genuinely good.
Yep, absolutely. And nowadays, I wonder if a game like Power Grid would be as successful. And it's tough to tell because we'd have to erase Power Grid from our minds. Like, there's so many games at this point that have been influenced by Power Grid, like the Networks, for example, that it's tough to remove. Like, once you remove Power Grid, you're removing all the games that have been influenced by Power Grid. So that's a really tough exercise to do. So if Power Grid came out nowadays, I wonder how it would do, but that's a tough thing to make because it is such an influential game, especially to someone like me.
So Friedman Freezer, I would say, is as close to an auteur as you can imagine in the board gaming world. He seems to have his own particular vision that he's able to put out there. As board games become more professionalized, as the Asmodee truck sort of rolls on and on and on, do you think it's possible for people like Friedman Freezer to still be around and still be popular?
I'm very lucky. I've had the pleasure of chatting with Friedman several times, and I'm really happy about that. But chatting with him, I remember I was playtesting Fortress earlier last year, and I said, I asked him what I usually ask a lot of designers. I asked him, so who's the market for this game? Like, who are you marketing this game to? And he just shrugged. He said, I'm making this game for me, And there aren't a lot of designers with the clout, or designer publishers especially, with the clout to do that. But he's absolutely an auteur. He absolutely is making these games because they need to come out, With 504, he made that game because I think it would have caused him physical discomfort to not make it, He had this idea and he had to explore it, and he had to release it, So he's absolutely an auteur. He's absolutely doing what the muse gives him. He's not doing this for money at this, he is doing it for money because he's making a living, but he's not releasing the game that's going to make him the most money. He's releasing the games that interest him the most, and he's letting Power Grid and whatever games are offshoots of Power Grids, he's letting those really help make the money for him, because, he did wind up releasing a hit, and he's been able to work off that hit, and that hit has given him the freedom to come up with these really wonderful, bizarre, off-the-wall games that, even if I'm not crazy about them, I'm still so happy they exist.
So he's inspired you a great deal as a designer. If you were to try and pin down your own design ethos, what is it? I've
tried doing this. I'm not entirely sure yet. And I'm a little afraid to, because I don't want to pigeonhole myself, I don't want to say, well, this is my design ethos, and then move away from it. I will say that I have a mantra that I use anytime I get stuck, and I've mentioned this before in talks, so people are familiar with it at this point. It's my familiar saying, incentivize interesting behavior. That's my motto as a game designer, and I think that's the job of any game designer. Video game designer, educational game designer, your job is to incentivize behavior from your players that is the most interesting out of the game. You don't want to incentivize them to do boring things. You don't want to incentivize them to pass every turn, unless for some reason passing is interesting in your game, in which case you should incentivize them to do it. But you should incentivize them to do stuff that's interesting. And if you want to lead them towards a hard choice, you have to incentivize them to that choice. And then you have to know to sort of drop the incentives or dangle different bits of incentives, one on path A, one on path B. So if they go left or right, they get different flavors of carrots. And which flavor do they want? I've mentioned before, I think in the tabletop world, especially in the board game world, I think compared to the video game world, we're just leaving the Intellivision, ColecoVision era, and we're just entering the 16-bit Nintendo era, I think, with board games. I think that's how far behind we are. Right now, the board games we play have all these assumptions, just like a 2600 game had these assumptions that, like, the game was likely going to be endless until you died, and there would be some sort of score, and there would be all these sorts of variants that you could toggle with levers. And then when you got into the NES era, the rules shifted, and the game could have several levels, and it could work towards a finite ending, and it could show you cutscenes. There's these things that the Atari couldn't do. And because that technology changed, the ability to tell the story changed. And because of that, the craft of the game design changed. And I think we're seeing a similar thing here as we're finding more tools to make games, as we're creating games that are as we create legacy games, as we create micro games, as we create these one-shot games like Time Stories and your favorite, Exit, as we create all these games, we're finding this different vocabulary. The point is, it is it's a different way to frame a game. It's a different way to look at games. Instead of sort of this monolithic, a game is something you put on a table and you play it, and then there's a winner and everybody has a good time, and then you put it back on the shelf, and then hopefully you want to play it again really soon. And that's what we assume a game is right now. And maybe someday, maybe in 10 years, a board game can be something that you bring out with a bunch of close friends and you play it, and it's actually really hard, and it can be difficult and awkward, but you finish it, and it's like finishing like a really hard movie. It's like, oh my God, that was amazing. And then you put it back in the box, and then somebody says, hey, can I borrow that? And you just give it to them like you'd give a book to someone, and you don't really care if they give it back or not.
So moving on to your fourth game.
Yes.
This is the one game on your list that I must confess I've absolutely no knowledge of. I think I saw one Rado playthrough of it, but I've certainly never been near it. I've never seen it played in my game group. This is St. Petersburg. Why? You say in the description you gave me that it taught you about drafting. And did this inspire the networks in any way?
In some ways, yes. Because at the time, when I played St. Petersburg, I loved auctions. And in the air, there were so many auction games coming out. That was pretty much, I wouldn't say it was the hot mechanism, but it was certainly a hot mechanism. The problem with auctions is they tend to make your game very abstract. Because it's a lot of rules on how to do the auction. And here is this game, St. Petersburg, and it could have been an auction game very easily, but it wasn't. It's a drafting game. Specifically, we call it a Rochester draft. It's a term from Magic, and I have to admit I don't really play much Magic because the guy from Pathfinder destroyed me. Magic players have this term called Rochester draft, where you put these cards face up on the table and everybody takes turns picking one up. And that's how St. Petersburg works. You have all these cards face up on the table, and on your turn, you either, you pick up a card, you either buy it or you put it in your hand, or you can buy a card that you had previously placed in your hand. And that's pretty much it. But there's 4 different kinds of cards, and the way they interact is very interesting, and you want to sort of be aware of how all those different cards work. The fact that it's not an auction game, the fact that it's a drafting game, especially the way that game implemented it, took what I loved about auctions and it pulled out 75% of the fluff, and then all that was left was just this really pure version of the game that's just, I remember in your view of the networks, you said you develop a show by picking up a card, you sign a star by picking up a card, you land an ad by picking up a card. And that's what I loved about St. Petersburg. Pretty much the whole game is just you pick up a card, you pick up a card, and you pick up a card. And I love that mechanism because it's so easy to implement, and there's no barrier between the player and the mechanism.
What I loved about the networks, and I'm constantly in awe of designers in the sense that essentially the networks is you do one thing on your turn.
Yeah.
But from that, a whole tree of complexity grows.
Yep.
And I'm constantly amazed at that complexity from simplicity thing, because I certainly don't work in that way. My brain is completely chaotic and complex and, simultaneously complex and completely moronic, whereas the network seems so simple, and from that simplicity comes complexity. And I think it's really, really admirable if you can think in that way.
Thank you. It did take a lot of work to get there, a lot of really bad playtests.
And so we move on now. We're almost at the present. So you started Formal Ferret. What gave you the decision to go alone? And what do you think it is about the current climate that facilitates people being able to publish their own work?
There was quite a few things. I mentioned my frustration when Prolix first came out. With Battle Merchants, I think Minion did a beautiful job on the game, but Minion is not a company that goes to conventions, and I love going to conventions. And it's not like I could go to conventions on Minion's behalf, because then Minion would still have to pay for the convention, which they didn't want to do. But I want to be able to I want to be at conventions, so I realized let's put my realization on the shelf for a moment. I got really extremely wildly lucky in 2014 in that I got an invite to the Gathering of Friends. And I'm still extremely grateful because it really did change your life. Because when I came in, I was a hobbyist game designer who had a day job that I was getting less and less interested by the week. And I think those feelings were frankly reciprocated as I was getting more and more into game design. I was getting less and less into work. And so that was my mindset going in. I still sort of viewed myself as a hobbyist game designer. I'll never start my own game company. Game companies are a lot of work. So I go into the Gathering of Friends and I'm surrounded by people for whom games are their lives. Literally, they work every day in games. I pitch my game to a bunch of publishers. Some are interested, but only tepidly. This is the networks I'm pitching now. So I pitch it to several publishers, and some are like, this is okay, but it's going to have to go to the end of our queue. It won't be out till 2 or 3 years from now. Another one was like, well, I like it, but I don't like how it's scoring. I think the scoring should be more interactive. And others were just flat no's, no, there's no room in our lineup for this kind of game. And I look around the room and I realize there are way more designers than publishers. This pitching thing, is it really working? How come I don't want to start my own game company? Well, I don't want to have to ship my own games. Well, I don't have to anymore. At the time, Stone Meyer had released a document saying, well, I could just use Amazon to ship. I don't have to ship myself. And since then, all these fulfillment houses have come up. I use Funagain for fulfillment and Spiral Galaxy, and they are both absolutely amazing. They're wonderful to work with. And so I don't have to fulfill anymore. That was the big thing, by the way. I don't have to raise the money. I don't have to, have the money. I don't have to have $20,000 laying around because I can now raise it on Kickstarter, because by 2014, Kickstarter was pretty well established, but I don't have to ship the games anymore either. I don't have to deal with a random plant in China, because I could just go to a printer who has relationships with several manufacturers and go to one that works best. Nowadays I work with Panda, and Panda does all their own printing themselves. So all these excuses that I had started breaking down, and I was realizing, if I really want to do this right, I'm going to have to do it myself. And if I do it myself, that means I get to make the calls. I get to go to conventions. I get to decide what the game looks like. I get to decide in representation. I've seen publishers say well, we're okay being 75% men, 25% women in the art in the game, because that's just how conventions are. And, I want to say, no, I don't want to do that. I want to do 50-50. I don't care what conventions look like. This is what I want to work towards. This is what I want to represent. So I want to, so there are all these things that were now in my control, and I felt really good about that. So ultimately, I founded Formal Ferret because I wanted that level of control over my own games. And I'll be honest, I don't think the networks would have been a hit if I didn't have that element of control. And just like the bag from Prolix, all these little imperfections, they really start to add up, and that tipping point comes early and earlier, and people are just I would like it, but the scoring board is a pain in the neck, and this doesn't look right, and that doesn't look right. So there's so many details you have to get right, and I feel like being my own publisher, I have the opportunity to get those details right.
But that implies you have to be the kind of person who's very exacting. Is there a worry that a lot of dross will come out as self-publishing becomes easier and easier?
I don't think it's that self-publishing gets easier. I think the barrier to entry lowers, but it doesn't get easier, which is why you will see stuff from self-publishers not hitting that quality standard, and you're seeing it all over the place. And honestly, at the same time, you see a lot of people on Kickstarter who kickstarted a game in, say, 2014, 2015, 2016, who say, yeah, I'm good. That's it. I had my one game on Kickstarter. I never want to do that again, So while there are people who are flocking to Kickstarter to get their game out, there are plenty of people who are turning away from Kickstarter and be like, no, I'm just going to pitch from now on. I tried this once and it's not for me. So yeah, if you're on Kickstarter and you're just backing everything that looks good, you're going to get some good games. You're going to get some good games, and you're going to get some turkeys, because that barrier to entry is fairly low.
So your final game is probably the biggest behemoth in a list of behemoths. You chose Dominion.
Yes.
Why?
Because of all the games I've ever played, that was the game that, when it came out, and for a few years afterwards, that was the one game that we'd finish, and I'd be like, let's play again. And I never say that. I never say, let's play again. I always say, oh, what do we want to play next? Because there's all these other games I want to play. But when Dominion came out, I just wanted to play Dominion. That's all I wanted to play was Dominion. That is incredible. That is an incredible feat of game design. What Donald X. Vaccarino did, he had a few innovations in that game, and obviously deck building, in-game deck building was a big one, but what's more easily missed is the modularity of his games. And that's a recurring point with what Vaccarino does, is he always puts in modularity for his games. He always has these modules that you can pull in and pull out. And for his game, it was the kingdom cards. For Dominion, it was all the kingdom cards that, the game shipped with 25 different kinds of kingdom cards, of which you could only play with 10 at any time. So you had all these combinations that you could play with, and the game felt different every time. So when I wanted to play again, I didn't want to play with the same kingdom cards. I wanted to try all the other kingdom cards in the box and see, how does the game play now? Because each kingdom card could really radically alter the game. And that led to a really large play space, and I thought that was just amazing.
Yeah, so Dominion's given birth to a lot of clones and a lot of copies and a glut of in-game deck builders. Should we regret that, or should we just admire Dominion for how epoch-making it was?
Definitely admire Dominion. There are a few Dominion, I call them LDBs, like Dominion, but so for example, Trains, it's an LDB. It's like Dominion, but it has a board. There's this game called Nightfall. It's like Dominion, but you can attack the other players. And these LDBs, I don't think they did deck building any favors because they didn't really increment much. Deck building is such a turnkey solution, you know? It feels like when you bring deck building into a game, you bring so many decisions with it that it feels like half of the work is done for you already. So it can really, if it's not done properly, it can really promote really lazy game design, as opposed to really interesting and innovative deck builders like, for example, Eminent Domain, which is a deck builder that feels nothing like Dominion, because it's really all about, like, every card that you play, you get a card of that kind into your deck, so your deck learns what you do, and that tailors your deck based on the actions you take. That's still such a fascinating concept after all these years. You know, the game came out like 5 years ago, and it's still like a really intriguing concept. Xenon Profiteer is an amazing deck builder because there's so many things and it doesn't seem to change much, but what it changes is enormous, like removing the economy from the cards, really formalizing like what stays out in front of you. It's a very, very clever game. That's one of my favorite deck building games. I think ultimately, number one, deck building is this real turnkey solution, so it can lead to lazy game design. And I see a lot of, like, people in my game group come in with deck builders, and I ask, my playtest group that is, and ask them, so why is this a deck builder? Like, why are you making a deck builder? Now, some games, like my friend Tim Rodriguez wanted to make a deck builder about making wine, and I thought that was brilliant. Because thematically, deck builders, like, generally when you see a deck builder, the deck building doesn't really model anything thematically, and yet Tim's game, it would have, because deck building is a great way to model the passage of time. So you would get grapes, you'd buy grapes with your cards, and you put the grapes in your discard pile, then you'd shuffle your discard pile, and you start drawing, and then you'd play your grapes, and your grapes would turn into a wine that you put in the cellar. So now you change the grapes into like a cask that you put in your discard pile, and now that's in your wine cellar, and you shuffle, and then when it comes back out, you play it, and now you can sell your wine, you know? Whereas someone else says, this is a game that's a deck builder. I'm like, well, why is it a deck builder? And they're like, I don't know. I'm like, well, are you sure this should be a deck builder? Why is this a deck builder? And a lot of designers never ask that question, and they wind up with a game where being a deck builder was supposed to be a feature, and now it's just a bug. Because people hear deck builder and like, well, okay, well, what makes this different than all the other zillion deck builders that are out there? Now, granted, I don't think deck building is as hot as it was. I think all the people that would have made deck building games, they also would have made micro games when micro games were hot. They would have made worker placement games when worker placement games were hot. They would have made auction games when auction games are hot. Now those poor suckers are making legacy games, and legacy games are really, really really hard to make. So that's why we haven't heard anything from them in a while. But yeah, deck builders, now that they're not as in vogue as they were, there's still some deck building games coming out. I don't think it's as bad as it was, but man, you could be really lazy with a deck builder, because unlike other mechanisms, like with a worker placement games, there's still a lot you had to design. There's just so many implications that come with a deck builder. Trashing cards, making your deck lean, making your deck efficient, versus having a drawing strategy, cards that favor drawing, that sort of thing. So many things that people pulled from Dominion and just without question putting it in.
And so do you think the LDB is on its way out? Because you see more and more games having deck building as a component mechanic of a larger game rather than having it as the main part. Do you see that as the future of deck building?
It's tough to have a game that's entirely about deck building unless it reinvents deck building, and that's certainly not off the table. Like Orlean showed us that you could do it with bag building. So, of course, that's part of another game, but every part of that game is sort of focused on what you pull out of the bag. And I think you really see it with hand-building games, games like Rococo and Lewis and Clark, and now most recently Century Spice Road. But because hand building is much more lightweight, and it's like with a traditional deck builder, one of these unquestioned rules of a deck builder is when you buy a card, you put it in your discard pile and you've got to wait some time for it to cycle back to you. Whereas with a hand builder, it seems that when you buy a card, it goes right to your hand. And frankly, for me, that's a lot more fun. It's back to incentivizing interesting behavior. I bought this card, let me play with it. So I think that's one reason why hand building games, there seems to be less baggage, less weight with a hand builder, because it's a cleaner mechanism. It's less granular. It requires fewer components. It requires fewer cards, and it's much quicker. And there's less left to chance and randomness, because instead of reshuffling your deck and drawing the top 5 cards, instead you pick up all the cards you played and you can play any card that you had. So there's a lot more that luck is removed from it, which resonates better with a lot of players. So I see that we're getting more refinement towards hand building instead of deck building, if you want to talk about things being a component of a game. But deck building, I think, more or less is going to be with us from now on. Same way worker placement and auctions are going to be with us from now on.
Looking into the future, what next for Formal Ferret?
Last year was about solidifying the networks. I reprinted the networks 3 times last year. The third printing is about to leave the factory now. I started that printing in December, but is really about establishing the networks. I only released one new game, that was Wordsy, and now this year I'm going to be releasing the expansion for the networks, the executives. I'm going to have some small decks of cards that are hopefully going to be just little packs of shows that you can plug into your game. So I'm going to have more shows that you can put into the networks, and hopefully later this year I'm going to put a brand new game on Kickstarter. Oh, and I'm also kickstarting my in March I'm kickstarting my game Bad Medicine, which is the first game that Formal Ferret did. So I'm putting that back on Kickstarter, and hopefully by December, I'm going to have my whole product line in my warehouse, which is going to be a very exciting time. And hopefully later this year, I'll have a totally new game that I'll have on Kickstarter. So fingers crossed I can do that. And then looking even deeper in the future, I'd love to raise enough capital that I don't have to be on Kickstarter anymore. And then I could just have the capital, print a game, and then I could work much more closely with retail stores, having launch kits and that sort of thing. Stonemaier recently made that jump, and I'd love to make that jump also. It's like anything else in life, There's no choice you're going to make where suddenly everything magically gets wonderful and there's no pain ever. There's no such thing as those happy endings. That doesn't exist. What you're doing is you're replacing one set of problems with a different set of problems, with the hope that that other set of problems is preferable.
So you're heading up to the cabin, you're fleeing the imminent danger, and the car skids around a corner, and 4 of your 5 games that you've chosen fly out into a ravine and are swept away down a river. Which is the one that you hope is still laying on the backseat of the car?
Let them all go. Let them all go.
Fantastic. So if people want to contact you and find out what you're doing, how can they do that?
Okay, you can hit me on Twitter at Gil Hova, Gilhova. Exactly the same handle for Instagram, Gilhova. If you want to hit me on Facebook, find me at Formal Ferret Games. If you want to go to my blog, gil.hova.net. If you just want to see what my company has to offer, formalferretgames.com. And if you want to sign up for my mailing list, formalferretgames.com.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for giving over your time.
My pleasure, Ben. This is awesome.
And if you want to suggest guests, or you just want to say something nice about the show, or if you just want to say something horrible about the show, you can contact me on @5gamesfordoomsday on Twitter, or at 5gamesfordoomsday@gmail.com. And if I haven't had to abscond to my cabin in the woods to escape the flesh-eating nuns and the clouds of falling unicorn dung, I'll see you in 2 weeks for another 5 Games for Doomsday.